The name is Joseph Fallon, and my article is about the clan system in Central Asia, former Soviet republics. It's called Full Circle: Identity, Soviet Nationalities Policy in Central Asia, because the whole history of the clans transcends the Soviet Union. It was there before and it's there after. And so I was fascinated by the fact that after independence, the fall of the Soviet Union, these entities didn't merge. And there is a Pan-Turkic Union Council, but there's no amalgamation, there's no unification. So on the one hand, you have, well, the entities that were created have vested interests, they're politicians, in keeping them separate. But then I looked more, and there's something unique, and that is the clans. When the Soviets took over, they were very weak, and they, for necessity, had to make alliances with originally the ones that were more westernized, the Jadids, the new school. There were Kazakh intellectuals that were taught or educated in Russia. So they're using the local, it wasn't a leadership of the community, but an elite group that were westernized. And this is where, in my opinion, the problem came. They were using Western concepts of nation and applying it to an area that had no experience like that. There were empires, but they were multi-ethnic. There were city-states and kingdoms, but they were multi-ethnic. What was tying them together? Usually, it was an alliance of clans. So when the Soviets came in, they decided to co-opt the local leadership, originally the pro-Western Westernization faction, by giving them positions in government and in the Communist Party. Then they had to deal with the Basmachis. Well, the Basmachis were defeated, but there was still rumbling from the traditional society. So they were co-opting some of the more agreeable elements into their government, and they call this an indigenization process. Well, the clans started taking advantage of this indigenization process. And it turned out that the Soviets, in addition to indigenization, had affirmative action for certain tribes. Now, the goal of the Soviets, this stated, was to modernize the clans out of existence. However, through indigenization, through affirmative action called tribal policy, they were reinforcing tribal identity, the clan's identity. And they had to rely on it. It became a symbiotic relations. The Soviets needed the clans to keep the peace and to provide the staffing for the government down there. The clans needed the Soviets so they can have the positions to give to their clientele. But it came to the point where certain clans just agreed among themselves. How are we going to divide up the offices and powers of the Soviets? And this is within the Soviet Union. The difference in Central Asia was primarily three. There was cattle raising, which was primarily nomads. There was agricultural groups, and there was the cities. The language of all of the Turkic groups was so heavily influenced by Persian and Arabic that, as they said, they understood each other. A Kazakh and a Kyrgyz are essentially the same. They consider themselves so closely related. There's a famous folk singer, Kazakh, whose one song goes, um, my body is Kazakh, my bones are Kyrgyz. The relationship. Um, it's interesting when the Soviets didn't know what to do, they would start to designate groups as, when this assimilation process, this amalgamation began, to designate them as mountain something. So the Kyrgyz were the mountain Kazakhs. The Palmaris were the mountain Tajiks. It kind of tried to give a gloss of legitimacy to the fact that no, these were distinct groups by your own definition. But again, that definition had that ominous ending that nations have an ending. And if the Soviets could create them, they could try to end them by just amalgamating. Even today, the borders aren't delineated. The Soviets were so interested, they gave up in the 20s. They tried again in the 50s, gave up on that. And the borders between, in particular, the Kyrgyz and Tajik is unresolved. And the unfortunate part is it's in what's called the Ferghana Valley. And this is a rich area that has the majority of the population of the entire region and is the breadbasket for the entire region. But it was divided in such a way that part of it's in Uzbekistan, part of it's in Kyrgyzstan, part of it's in Tajikistan. But for some particular reason, the greatest hostility, and it has resulted in border wars, put that war in quotes, uh, between the Tajiks and the Kyrgyz, um, because they were never delineated. And you have the issue of the irrigation, the waters coming from the Pamir Mountains, who has control of it. During the Soviets, they had the lines, the borders, even if they weren't fully delineated, but the economics was all done as a unified system, a unified electronic grid, unified road system, and things like that. Once independence, all of a sudden, those were broken. Now, the friction over the borders leads to the other cascading effects, no pun intended, about the waters, the hydroelectric, the reservoirs, all that, which was not a significant problem during the Soviet times. But they created something that was about, at some point, would have to be addressed, in which they never did, about the relationship between the Tajiks and Kyrgyz economically. Um, but it is remarkable. First, the Soviets needed them, and they relied, as I said, on the westernized intelligentsia, but those were part of a clan, and they would have to rely on support. So the clans developed greater and greater strength until, first in the Soviets and now in post-Soviets, it's come full circle. They are the most important aspect on the political and economic life of these political entities. I just find it fascinating how it's not necessarily history repeats itself. It's just that you have an ideology that doesn't take into consideration the conditions of another culture, another people, try to impose it, and it turns around, they lose. What they try to modernize out of existence took over their modernization process.